The tones dropped at 14 minutes past 3 in the morning, and the first thing Marcus Delgado heard, before the address, before the structure type, before the code, was the name. Harwick Elementary School. Building collapse, possible entrapment, juvenile victim confirmed. He was already sitting up in the dark of his apartment, feet on the cold floor, the way he'd been sitting up at 14 minutes past 3 for the better part of 11 months. Not because he was waiting for a call. He wasn't on calls anymore. He sat up because that was when the dreams always broke apart, the sound of concrete giving way, the scream of a past device nobody could locate, the 42 seconds of radio silence that had ended his career and cost him everything except his certification, which the department had kept like a hostage while they decided what to do with him. He listened to the scanner on his nightstand the way some men listen to rain. The address hit him before the dispatcher finished reading it. Harwick Elementary. He knew that building. He had known it for 19 years, since his first year on Engine 6 when they'd done a pre-planned walkthrough and he'd stood in the basement utility corridor and looked up at the original 1951 concrete flat slab construction and told Captain Arsenault that the drop ceiling grid was hiding a rebar situation that nobody had looked at since the 1983 renovation. Arsenault had nodded and written something in his notepad, and nothing had ever been done about it. Marcus sat in the dark and listened to the units being dispatched. Engine 6, Engine 12, Ladder 3, Battalion 1. He heard Chief Raymond Harwick's voice come over the radio 8 seconds after the tones dropped, clipped, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 31 years learning to sound calm when the world was ending, and something in Marcus's chest went cold and still. Harwick was working. That meant his son was home. He was in his truck with his boots on and his off-duty bag in the back before he had finished thinking the thought. He is not supposed to be doing this. That thought came and went like smoke through a cracked window. The investigation board had placed him on administrative reassignment, not suspension. His certification was intact. He had done nothing wrong, not technically, not legally, not by any standard that mattered in the dark of a burning building. But the department had needed someone to absorb the weight of a bad outcome, and Marcus had been standing in exactly the wrong place with exactly the wrong history. And so, the weight had landed on him. His badge sat in a desk drawer at the administrative building on 5th Street. His gear was in the back of his truck because he had never been able to take it out. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that the stories that stay with you longest are the ones that start exactly like this. One person, one decision before dawn when the world is still dark enough that you can pretend nobody is watching. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to change the way you think about what it means to earn trust in the fire service. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this one travels. The Harwick Elementary building occupied a full city block on the corner of Connell and 9th. It had been built as a public school, converted to a community center in 2004, converted again to a mixed-use recreation and event facility in 2018, which meant it had been through 3 major structural renovation phases, each one layering new construction vocabulary over the original 1951 bones, and not one of those renovations had been accompanied by a full structural reassessment of the basement utility corridor that Marcus Delgado had flagged 19 years ago. He knew this because he had checked twice, once in 2011 and once in 2017, both times pulling the permit history and finding the same gap. The original sub-slab rebar grid had never been retested for load compliance after the 2018 renovation added a second-floor event space directly above the utility corridor. He parked 2 blocks out and walked in. The scene was controlled chaos in the particular way that multi-company responses at 0300 become controlled chaos. The apparatus staged correctly, the command post established, the IC running accountability, everything by the book, everything moving with professional precision. 3 engine companies and a ladder had water on the collapse zone in the east wing, where a section of the second-floor event space had pancaked down into the basement level. The collapse was partial, maybe 40 feet of floor deck, 1 primary structural column visibly compromised, the secondary column on the northeast corner showing stress fractures that Marcus could see from 30 yards away in the amber spill of the working lights. He stood at the tape and looked at the northeast corner for a long time. Chief Raymond Harwick was at the command post, a folding table set up beside Battalion 1's SUV, with his radio in one hand and his accountability board in the other. He was 61 years old, 2 years from retirement, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, and he had the particular stillness of a man running a hard incident on pure muscle memory while something was eating him alive from the inside out. Marcus had known Raymond Harwick for 19 years. He had never seen his hands shake. His hands were shaking. Beside the command post, a woman in a red fleece jacket was talking to one of the engine lieutenants. Marcus recognized her, Carla Harwick, Raymond's wife, the woman who ran the before-school breakfast program at this facility every Tuesday and Thursday, the woman who had given Marcus a piece of lemon cake at the department retirement party for Captain Arsenault 12 years ago and said he seemed too young to be looking so tired. She was not crying. She was doing something more terrible than crying. She was standing completely still with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the collapse zone with the focused, desperate attention of a person who has decided that if they watch hard enough, they can pull someone out of the rubble by sheer force of will. Dylan Harwick, 14 years old. According to what Marcus had picked up from the scanner and the fragments of radio traffic he'd caught walking in, Dylan had been at a late event at the facility with a youth athletics program, had stayed after to help stack equipment in the basement storage room when the floor above let go. He'd been in the collapse zone for 22 minutes by the time Marcus reached the tape. The RIT, Rapid Intervention Team, was staged but not deployed. The rescue company had a 2-person search team inside the structure, but they were working the near side of the collapse, the section closest to the access point, because the northeast corner was assessed as too unstable for entry. Marcus watched Lieutenant Chen from Rescue 1 come back out through the access breach in the east wall, pull his facepiece, and walk directly to the command post with the particular gait of someone who is about to deliver information that nobody wants to hear. He was too far away to hear the words. He didn't need to. He read it in the way Raymond Harwick's hand tightened around his radio until the knuckles went pale. Marcus looked at the northeast corner again. The secondary column wasn't going to fall. He could see that from here if you knew what you were looking at. It was showing stress fracture propagation in a vertical pattern, which meant it was redistributing load upward and laterally, not compressing downward. The floor section that had already pancaked had partially relieved the load on the northeast quadrant. What the rescue team was reading as an unstable entry condition was actually a post-collapse load redistribution that had, paradoxically, created a window of relative stability in the northeast corner. Maybe 12 feet wide, maybe 20 minutes deep before secondary movement began. He knew this the way he knew the back of his own hands. He knew it because he had studied that building, and because he had spent 19 years learning to read structural behavior under stress the same way he had spent 19 years learning to read smoke. He knew it in his body before he finished thinking it with his brain. He ducked under the tape. Nobody stopped him immediately because at a large-scale incident with multiple companies working, a person moving with purpose in turnout gear is a person moving with purpose. The question of whether they belong there is secondary to the appearance of competent motion. Marcus had his gear on before anyone got a clear look at him. His helmet was his old helmet, the one from before. Station 11, the green shield from his previous assignment, not the current department issue white and gold. He had never gotten around to swapping the shield. It would become significant later. He moved along the east wall toward the access breach, and he did not run because running at a collapse scene signals panic, and panic is contagious, and the last thing he needed was for someone to read panic off his body before he could get inside. He walked with the particular economy of movement that 19 years of fireground work had burned into his nervous system. Not hurried, not hesitant, every step deliberate, every movement purposeful, the kind of motion that a crew reads as competence and responds to with instinctive deference even when they don't know your face. He went through the breach. The interior of the east wing was operating under working lights that the crew had strung. A strand of portable LED floods powered off the generator truck, throwing flat white light across the collapsed debris field. The smell hit him first, the particular compound smell of a fresh structural collapse. Concrete dust and disturbed earth and something chemical from the ruptured utility lines, and underneath all of it, the specific damp and cold of a building that had been breathing for 70 years and was suddenly, violently open to the night air. No fire. The collapse was mechanical, not thermal, but the building was making sounds. The low, intermittent groan of stressed material finding new equilibrium, the pop of a joint releasing somewhere in the dark to his right, the trickle of concrete aggregate shifting through the gaps in the debris field. He paused at the edge of the debris field and turned his TIC on. Thermal imaging in a collapse environment was different from thermal imaging in a fire. There was no thermal differential from fire heat to work against, so the technology was less useful for finding victims and more useful for reading structural heat signatures, areas where material compression was generating friction warmth, zones of load transfer. Marcus swept the TIC across the debris field slowly. The northeast corner showed exactly what he expected, a relative cold zone, which meant low thermal loading, which meant the debris there had settled and was not actively compressing. The rescue team had read the surface indicators of the structural damage and made the correct assessment by the book. They had not made the correct assessment by the building. He moved into the debris field. The technique for moving through a collapsed debris field is something that gets covered in USAR training, urban search and rescue, and covered again in collapse rescue certification, and then it either lives in your hands or it doesn't. It lives in Marcus Delgado's hands. He moved with his weight distributed low and wide, testing each contact point before committing his weight, using a 6-point movement pattern that took 3 times longer than walking, but generated approximately 1/8 the ground vibration, which mattered in a partially settled debris field, the way the difference between a spark and an open flame matters in a fuel-rich environment. His knees were making the particular complaint that 43-year-old knees make when they are carrying 60 pounds of gear through a debris field at 0300, but his knees had been making that complaint for the better part of 5 years, and they had learned, like the rest of him, to make the complaint quietly and keep moving. He was at the edge of the northeast quadrant when he heard it. Not a voice, something smaller, a rhythm. The specific arrhythmic tapping that USAR protocols teach to trapped victims. 3 short, pause, 3 short, pause. The international distress signal that someone had either taught Dylan Harwick or that he had intuited from some animal certainty about the frequency of human hearing. The sound was coming from under approximately 2 feet of concrete slab debris, from the corner where the subfloor storage room had existed, before the floor deck above it came down and converted it from a room into a void space. A void space that, according to the load distribution Marcus had read from the street, was currently braced by the pancaked floor slab in a way that was supporting rather than crushing the space below. He made it to the northeast corner in 4 minutes and 20 seconds of deliberate low-impact movement. He could hear the tapping clearly now, and he could hear something else. Irregular breathing, fast and shallow. The breathing pattern of someone who is scared and hurt and has been conserving air in an enclosed space. He pressed his hand flat against the debris surface above the sound and felt nothing. No movement. The debris above the void was settled. He put his face close to a gap in the concrete and said quietly, the way he said everything, "Dylan Harwick." The tapping stopped. A pause that lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Marcus to count them. Then, yeah. A voice that was trying to sound steady and was mostly managing it. "My name is Marcus. I'm a firefighter. I'm going to get you out of there. Are you hurt?" Another pause. "My leg. I think my leg is... There's something on my leg. I can move my foot, but it hurts bad. Can you breathe okay?" "Yeah, there's a shelf or something above me. I've got room." The shelf was what Marcus had guessed. The metal storage shelving unit in the subfloor storage room had taken the initial impact of the floor deck and deflected it, creating a survivable void space approximately 3 feet by 5 feet with 18 to 24 inches of vertical clearance. Dylan Harwick was alive because of a steel shelving unit that someone had bolted to the wall in 2019. "Okay," Marcus said. "You're going to hear me working up here. I need you to stay still and keep your breathing slow. Can you do that?" "Yeah, a beat." "Is my dad here?" Marcus did not hesitate. "He's outside. He knows you're in here." He started assessing the access point. The problem with collapse rescue is not usually the finding. Finding is training and patience and sometimes luck. The problem is the getting out, the precise load-conscious work of removing debris from a collapse void, without triggering secondary movement, without shifting the load distribution that is currently keeping the void space intact, without doing any of the things that feel productive and efficient and that will, if done incorrectly, transform a survivable void into a lethal compression event. Marcus had seen it happen once on a building collapse in 2012, and he had stood 12 feet away and been unable to do anything except watch. The particular weight of that memory lived somewhere between his shoulders and never left. He was not going to watch it happen again. He identified the access sequence, 4 pieces of debris that needed to be removed in a specific order to open an approach corridor to the void without disturbing the load-bearing debris above it. The first piece was a section of concrete slab about 14 inches by 30 inches and maybe 400 pounds, too heavy to lift, too large to drag without creating lateral pressure on the adjacent debris column. He needed to break it. He pulled the flathead axe from his belt loop and located the stress fracture that was already propagating through the slab, a hairline crack running parallel to the rebar line that he could feel with his gloved fingers before he could see it in the working light. He placed the axe head at the fracture propagation point and struck 3 times, controlled, precise, each strike on the same point at the same angle, and the slab separated cleanly along the line. He was aware, distantly, of voices behind him. Not the sounds of the working structure, different voices, sharper, closer, the voices of people who had just noticed him. He did not turn around. He removed the first 2 debris sections in 8 minutes. The third section, a partial concrete block wall that had come down in a single monolithic piece, required a different approach. He needed a tool he didn't have on his belt. He looked at the debris field around him and found what he needed 11 feet to his left, a 2-foot section of rebar protruding from a slab fragment, the end bent at approximately 80 degrees from the original break. He worked it free from the slab with 3 minutes of patient leverage and used it as a pry bar against the block wall section, working the toe of it under the near edge and applying gradual pressure until the section pivoted on its axis and he could guide it down and away from the void approach corridor without dropping it. The voices behind him were louder now. One of them was Raymond Harwick. "Stop, right now, stop what you're doing and get out of there." Marcus did not stop. He moved to the 4th debris section, a collapsed metal doorframe tangled with electrical conduit, and began working it free from the corridor approach. His hands were entirely calm. His hands were always calm. It was the one thing that had never required training. "Delgado." Harwick's voice changed, not louder but different in quality. The particular register of a man who has just processed a piece of information that restructures everything. "Delgado, that's an unstable entry zone. I will have you physically removed." Marcus spoke without turning around, without raising his voice, in the same flat tone he would have used to read a gauge. "Northeast corner is post-collapse stable. Load redistribution from the primary pancake event took pressure off this quadrant. Your rescue team read the surface indicators correctly and the structural indicators wrong. Dylan is in a void space under the storage shelf, mobile, breathing, possible tib-fib fracture on the right leg. I need 4 more minutes." Silence. Not the silence of compliance. The silence of a man who has just heard the name of his son and the word mobile and the word breathing, and whose body has made all the decisions before his rank can intervene. 4 minutes, Raymond Harwick said. His voice was a different thing now. Marcus removed the door frame. The approach corridor was open, a crawl space passage approximately 22 inches wide and 30 inches tall, angling down into the debris field at roughly 15 degrees. Too narrow for full turnout gear, which meant Marcus had to shed his coat and slide through in his structural liner and helmet, dragging his coat behind him to push through the void opening once he reached Dylan. He pulled the coat off and handed it back behind him without looking, felt someone take it, moved into the approach corridor on his forearms and knees. The void space was exactly what he had projected. 3 feet by 5 feet, 18 inches of vertical clearance at the high point, the steel shelving unit above serving as an inadvertent but sufficient load-deflecting arch. Dylan Harwick was on his back, with his right leg pinned under a single concrete block approximately 12 by 8 by 4 inches, not the catastrophic entrapment that full pancake collapse produced, but enough to generate serious pain and prevent self-extrication. The boy's face in the beam of Marcus's helmet light was pale and streaked with concrete dust, and entirely deliberately composed in the way that the sons of fire chiefs learned to compose their faces, and his eyes were wide and dark and fixed on Marcus with the specific intensity of someone who has been alone in the dark and hurt and doing the 3 short tap rhythm for 28 minutes and has just heard a voice. "Okay," Marcus said. "I see it. Can you feel your foot?" "Yeah, hurts when I move it." "That's actually good. Means circulation is intact." He pulled his glove off with his teeth, reached in and ran his fingers along the concrete block's edges, feeling for the load, checking whether it was bearing secondary weight from above or resting on its own mass. It was resting on its own mass. He had enough room to rotate it off Dylan's leg if he worked it correctly. "I'm going to move this block. It's going to hurt for about 3 seconds, and then it's going to hurt less. Are you ready?" Dylan Harwick looked at him for a moment and then said, with the bone-dry flatness of his father's voice in a 14-year-old register, "Been ready for 30 minutes. Marcus almost smiled. He rotated the block in a controlled pivot, lifting the near edge and walking it laterally 6 inches off Dylan's leg in a single smooth motion. Dylan made a sound that was not a scream. It was the sound that people make when they decide they are not going to scream and keep that decision by the thinnest possible margin. Marcus ran his hand along the boy's lower leg. No obvious deformity, no unnatural mobility. The kind of injury that was going to need imaging and probably a walking boot and would feel like nothing at all in about 3 weeks. He shrugged his turnout coat through the void entrance, folded it under Dylan's head as a cushion. "Can you push with your arms?" "Yeah. I'm going to back out. You're going to come out head first, push with your arms. Use your left leg to help. Your right leg is going to drag. Don't try to protect it. Just let it drag. It'll hurt less than you think." He backed out of the approach corridor in 30 seconds. He took a position at the exit point and reached in, found Dylan's shoulders, and guided him through the crawl passage with the slow, continuous traction that collapse extrication required, not pulling, guiding, taking the weight off the boy's arms and letting his own body do the work of moving both of them through the passage without disturbing the debris corridor walls. 40 seconds. The passage held. Dylan Harwick came out into the northeast quadrant of Harwick Elementary School at 3:47 in the morning, concrete dust in his hair and a controlled expression on his face that cracked, precisely and completely, the moment he heard his father's voice say his name. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not something Marcus watched. He had already turned away, moving back through the debris field by the same route he'd come in, slow and deliberate, each step placed with the same 6-point distribution, giving the rescue medics room to work, giving the father and son the space that the moment required. He emerged through the breach in the east wall into the white-gold flood of working lights and the smell of diesel and the particular cold of a night scene after the immediate crisis has broken. And he stood for a moment with his hands at his sides and his helmet in his hand, breathing the cold air, feeling his knees report in clearly, now that the adrenaline had receded to a level where the body was allowed to have opinions again. Lieutenant Chen from Rescue 1 was standing 6 feet away. Chen was 40 years old, 15 years on the job, the kind of firefighter who registered every detail on a scene the way a camera records without interpretation. And he was looking at Marcus with an expression that was working very hard to remain professionally neutral and not entirely succeeding. "Station 11 shield," Chen said. Not a question. "Yeah." "Station 11 closed in 2016. "Yeah." Chen looked at the breach in the east wall where Dylan and his father had just disappeared into a crowd of medics and crew. He looked back at Marcus. "Where did you learn that approach sequence? That pry rotation on the block wall section? That's not USAR Level 1 technique." Marcus picked up his helmet and turned it in his hands, looking at the shield. "No." "Is it FEMA?" "No." Chen waited. When it became apparent that nothing further was coming, he said, with the precise economy of a man who has decided that some questions answer themselves, "Good rid on the northeast corner." "Building's 1951 flat slab," Marcus said. "Pre-plan it sometime. There's a rebar grid situation in the sub-basement utility corridor that nobody's looked at since '83. He walked to the tape and ducked under it. "If you're still with me right now, and I know you are, because you know there's more, hit that like button. This story isn't over. What comes next is what the fire service calls an investigation, and what it actually is a reckoning. The department's after-action investigation was initiated 48 hours after the rescue of Dylan Harwick, triggered by 3 simultaneous reports: the use of a personnel in administrative reassignment status in an active incident, unauthorized entry past the incident perimeter, and the deployment of non-standard extrication techniques in a collapse environment. The investigation was technically mandatory. Everyone in the administrative building on 5th Street knew it was also theater, but theater that had to be performed correctly, because the union was watching and the city council was watching, and 3 local news crews had footage of Marcus Delgado emerging from the breach in the east wall with the chief's son. Marcus appeared before the investigation board on a Tuesday morning. He appeared without a union representative because his union representative had called him at 7 in the morning to tell him that the union didn't know what to do with him, which was more honest than Marcus had expected, and which he had accepted with the equanimity of a man who had stopped expecting institutions to know what to do with him roughly 11 months prior. He sat in a chair across a table from Deputy Chief Sandra Okafor, the department's operations chief, and Captain Brian Malloy from Internal Affairs, and a city attorney named Greenfield, who held a pen like he was afraid of it. On the table between them was a file folder, an incident report, a printed copy of the access footage from Harwick Elementary's external camera system, and a photograph of Marcus's helmet shield. They asked about the unauthorized entry. He answered precisely. They asked about his assessment of the northeast corner's structural stability. He answered at length, with specific reference to the 1951 flat slab construction, the post-collapse load redistribution event, and the established USAR doctrine on post-collapse stability assessment that he had applied. He could see Okafor writing. He could see Malloy trying to find the angle that led somewhere actionable and not finding it. Then Greenfield asked about the approach sequence he had used in the debris field, the specific technique, where it came from. Marcus looked at the pen in Greenfield's hand. He looked at the file folder. He said, "That technique comes from FEMA Urban Search and Rescue Task Force 7. I was on Task Force 7 from 2005 to 2011. Advanced Rescue Specialist Certification, Collapse Operations Specialty. I was deployed to 4 federal collapse incidents during that period. The technique is documented in the Task Force 7 Operational Manual." The room was quiet. Okafor set her pen down, set hers. Malloy looked at the file folder. Marcus's personnel file, the one sitting in the administrative building's records room under his name, showed 19 years of service, Engine 6, Ladder 3, Station 11. It showed the standard certification stack, Firefighter 1 and 2, Hazmat Operations, Swift Water Awareness, USAR Level 1. It showed the incident from 11 months ago and the administrative reassignment. It did not show Task Force 7. It did not show Advanced Rescue Specialist. It did not show 4 federal deployment rotations because those deployments had been processed under a federal activation number that the department had never been asked to reconcile with his local personnel record, and Marcus had never volunteered the information because the work on Task Force 7 had been the work of a different version of himself, younger, pre-loss, the version that had believed the systems worked and that doing the job with everything you had was sufficient protection against the things that happened to people who did the job with everything they had. He had a copy of the federal deployment records in the truck. He had been carrying them for 11 months in the same bag with his gear, not sure what he was waiting for. Apparently, he had been waiting for this. He slid the documents across the table. Greenfield stopped being afraid of his pen and started writing. Okafor read the Task Force 7 credentials with the focused, assessing attention of a person reorganizing a substantial body of information. Malloy looked out the window. The investigation board met 3 more times. The city attorney filed a report. The union called back. The story ran in the local paper, first as a human interest piece about the chief's son, then as a longer piece about Marcus. Once a reporter had gotten hold of the Task Force 7 records and spent 2 weeks making phone calls to federal contacts. The headline read, "Disgraced Firefighter Who Saved Chief's Son Held Federal Rescue Credentials Department Never Knew About." Marcus thought the headline was somewhat dramatic. He also thought it was basically accurate, which was a combination he had come to associate with journalism. Raymond Harwick requested a private meeting with Marcus 8 days after the incident. They met in the chief's office, which was a room Marcus had been in once before, under circumstances that had not gone well, and he sat in the same chair he had sat in during the conversation that had ended in his administrative reassignment, and he looked at the same framed aerial photograph of the city on the same wall. Harwick sat across from him. He was not behind his desk. He had pulled his chair to the same side of the desk as Marcus, which was not something Marcus had expected from Raymond Harwick, and which told him something he would think about for a long time afterward. They sat for a moment without speaking, which was not uncomfortable. Two people who have both spent significant portions of their lives in silence for professional reasons, sitting in the particular quiet that comes after something large has passed. "Dylan starts physical therapy Thursday," Harwick said. "He'll be on the varsity team by March. The orthopedist says the fracture was minor." "Good," Marcus said. Another silence. "The Task Force 7 records," Harwick said. "You had them in the truck." "Yeah." "For 11 months." "Yeah." Harwick looked at the aerial photograph on the wall for a moment. He was not the kind of man whose face revealed a great deal, but the muscles along his jaw were doing something that Marcus read as the particular effort of a man who has a great deal to say and is deciding how much of it serves any purpose. "The incident 11 months ago," Harwick said, "the Pryor Street fire, the decision you made on the 4th floor." "Yeah." I reviewed the incident report again, the full report, not the summary. I looked at the thermal data from the TIC recordings. The floor failure happened 112 seconds after you pulled your crew out. He paused. "The board's finding was that your decision was premature and not supported by observable indicators at the time." I know what the finding was. The TIC data shows a thermal signature on the 4th floor consistent with void space fire travel in a lightweight engineered lumber system. Another pause. "The observable indicator that wasn't in the report. Nobody pulled the TIC recordings when they compiled the incident analysis." Marcus said nothing. His hands were entirely still on his knees. "I pulled them," Harwick said. 3 weeks ago, before the Harwick Elementary incident. I'd been meaning to pull them since the board meeting, and I'd had reasons not to. Some of them were good reasons, and some of them weren't, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." He looked at his hands. "Your read on that floor was correct. The crew would have lost the 4th floor with personnel on it if you hadn't called the evacuation when you did." The room was very quiet. Marcus thought about 11 months. He thought about the scanner on his nightstand and the dreams that broke at 14 minutes past 3, and the gear in the back of his truck that he had never been able to take out, because taking it out would have been an admission that it was over. He thought about sitting at the kitchen table of Station 11 on his last shift, drinking bad coffee while the crew moved around him in the deliberate, determinedly normal way that a crew moves around someone who is about to be assigned away, the way they don't quite meet your eyes, but they make sure your cup is always full. He thought about the particular kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone, the loneliness of being known by a job and then taken away from it, of walking past a fire scene at 3 in the morning and standing at the tape like a civilian. He pressed 2 fingers against the back of his left hand and held them there until the pressure centered him. "Okay," he said. Harwick picked up a folder from the desk and set it in front of Marcus. Inside was a single page, a reinstatement authorization with a department seal and Harwick's signature and a reassignment order. Station 11 was gone. What had been written on the reassignment line was, "Rescue Company 1. Advanced Rescue Specialist. Collapse Operations." Marcus looked at the page for a long time. "The position didn't exist before last week," Harwick said. "It does now. I've been talking to FEMA Task Force 7's regional coordinator about a formal partnership protocol. Turns out the department has a significant gap in collapse rescue doctrine that nobody had formally identified. I have no idea why." He said the last sentence with approximately zero expression, which, for Raymond Harwick, constituted a joke. Marcus picked up the page. "Your Task Force 7 certification needs a renewal course," Harwick continued. "The federal calendar shows a recertification rotation in March. I'd like you to go. And when you come back, I'd like you to develop a collapse rescue protocol for the department's USAR operations and start a cross-training program for Rescue 1. Marcus set the page back down on the desk. He looked at it. He picked it up again. "Harwick," he said. "Chief. Chief." Marcus looked at the reassignment order, at the words "collapse operations," at the department seal. Dylan's a good kid. Raymond Harwick's expression moved through something that was brief and complete, and then was gone. "He's a hell of a lot more than good," he said, with the particular fierce certainty of a man who has nearly lost something and knows precisely what it cost. Marcus folded the page and put it in his pocket. He stood. He offered his hand, and Harwick took it, and they shook once, firmly, the way that two people who are never going to be entirely comfortable with sentiment acknowledge something real between them. He drove to the administrative building on 5th Street and collected his badge from the desk drawer. He drove to Station 11. The building was still standing, repurposed now as a training annex, and sat in the truck in the parking lot for a few minutes, looking at the bay doors. He thought about Arsenault writing in his notepad. He thought about bad coffee and the sound of tones dropping in the dark. He thought about a 14-year-old kid in a void space doing the 3 short tap rhythm for 30 minutes, calm enough to stay still, smart enough to keep signaling, patient enough to wait for someone to come. He thought about the specific shape of trust, how it was not given, how it was not assigned, how it was not earned once and carried forward, how it had to be rebuilt from the ground every single time, with your hands and your knowledge and the willingness to walk through the breach when everyone else was standing at the tape. He drove to Rescue Company 1. He parked in the apparatus bay. He pulled his gear out of the back of his truck for the first time in 11 months and hung it on the rack in the bay with his boots inside the pants legs and the suspenders draped and the coat ready and the helmet on top. He went to find the kitchen. Before you move on from this story, here is what I want you to carry with you, because there is something real inside this narrative that matters beyond the drama of it. Collapse rescue is a science. The difference between a survivable void space and a fatal compression event is often a matter of knowing what to look for, understanding how structures distribute load after a failure event, how to read the difference between active settling and post-collapse stability, and how to move through a debris field without creating the secondary movement that kills rescuers and victims alike. When rescue teams assess a collapse zone as unstable, they are making a risk-benefit calculation with the information they have. That calculation is almost always correct. What this story illustrates is why specialized training, federal USAR certification, task force deployment experience, discipline-specific collapse doctrine exists alongside and separate from general firefighter certification. Not every emergency can be managed with a standard toolkit. The fire service has always known this. The lesson is in building the systems that put specialized skills where they are needed before the tones drop, not after. If this story stayed with you, subscribe right now. Every week there's a new story from inside the fire service, inside the ER, inside the moments where ordinary people find out who they actually are under pressure. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. And if you are in the fire service, active or retired, this one was for you. The tones will drop again. Be ready.